Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Remote Toll Puzzle Martyrs Festival for 2021. This session is about trade union priorities for climate. My name's Sue Ferns. I'm the Deputy General Secretary at Prospect and the General Counsel Lead on Environment and Energy issues. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Ed Milliband, MP, Shadow Secretary of State for Bays, and Sam Smith, who runs the Just Transition Centre for the ITUC, the International TUC. So the format we're going to do this afternoon is we'll hear from for a few minutes from each of our speakers, starting with Ed, and then over to Sam, and then we will move forward into some questions and discussion. It almost goes without saying that this is a really important and timely debate. We've seen the tragic stories about the flooding in Europe, about the terrible fires across the world. So what more signal do we need about the importance of climate as an issue for all of us? But we're also meeting at the end of the week where we have seen the publication of IPPR's Environmental Justice Commission report and also the report of the government's Green Jobs Task Force. So I think we should have plenty to talk about this afternoon. But let's start first with Ed Milliband and some introductory comments. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks so much, Sue. And it's great to be here on this warm and sunny day. It shows our collective dedication to the cause and indeed the people who are watching. So thank you for watching. And Sue, thank you to you for the work that you do at Prospect, because you're a real leader when it comes to the issue of the just transition. And I've really appreciated our conversation over the last 15 months or so and your leadership on this issue, and indeed that of Prospect and other trade unions. So I guess I was going to actually start where you started, which is to do with the terrible, appalling flooding that we've seen in Germany, the heat waves in other parts of the world, because I think it does remind us, in case we needed reminding, of the emergency that we face. You know, we think about climate change often as a theoretical future prospect. It isn't a theoretical future prospect. The climate crisis is here now, and it places an importance, obviously, on adaptation and resilience, and that is very, very crucial. But it also tells us that we've got to act with much greater urgency. You know, we are in the decisive decade. I think climate stands alone in the sense that the decisions we make in this decade will have implications for generations to come. Once the genie comes out of the bottle, it's very hard to put it back in. If we carry on emitting carbon in the way that we have over the next decade, as we have over the last 30, 40, 50, even more decades, then we won't be able to avoid more than 1.5 degrees of warming, and we'll see a lot more extreme weather events as we've seen over the last few weeks. So there's a real urgency to this. And then something that I often emphasize, and so you'll have heard me say this before, we often talk about the nightmare, and it is right to talk about the dangers, but we should also talk about the positive things that we can do to create a better world. But we can only do that if the transition is fair and the transition is just. And that's our subject today. And that's why it's so important to talk about what can be done to make sure this transition is fair for workers. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think the environmental movement, and I sort of put myself in this, have done enough to put workers and economic justice at the center of this vision. So I'm really interested to hear from Sam, so I won't go on for ages, but I thought I would mention 5 things that I think are incredibly important. And Sue, they reflect very much some of the things that we've seen in your very good Green Jobs Task Force report published earlier this week, and indeed the IPPR report that you mentioned. First, we need a plan. Government is good at setting targets, but bad at setting out plans. This government. And unless there is a plan for workers, for businesses, for local authorities, for people to sort of organize themselves within, so they know what is happening, where are things going, what's the what's the plan in relation to households and transport and industry, we're never going to succeed. You call for that in your Green Jobs Task Force. It's incredibly important. Secondly, finance. I think it's easy to talk about these issues without really, while avoiding the key issue of government finance. You know, why do I talk so much about this? Because I think that unless government provides the finance to oil the wheels of this transition, it will make it much, much harder. And that is true in relation to workers and the retraining of workers, the training of workers, and the creation of jobs. You know, I often think about this, what became a big hot button issue in the last few months, the Cumbria coal mine. And I don't think we can open a new coal mine in Cumbria, but I think we've got an obligation to the people of Cumbria to say, here is the alternative. Here are the alternative green jobs that can be created. But unless you provide the alternatives to people, we won't take people with us. And finance is absolutely crucial in this. And I'm afraid, and there's great ITUC research on this, when you look at what the government in the UK is doing, it's talking the talk on the targets, but it's not walking the walk on the finance. I think the proposals from this government are 6% of the level per capita of the Joe Biden stimulus. I think something like a quarter of what we're seeing in France and a third of what we're seeing in Germany. So it needs to start investing and putting its money where its mouth is. Thirdly, and you emphasize this in your Green Jobs Task Force report, for every high carbon industry, there needs to be a plan, and a plan involving workers. And, you know, I think our slogan, our commitment here should be no worker left behind. I know as a Doncaster MP, the dangers of an unplanned transition. We saw it in the coal mines with the closure of the pits in Doncaster in the 1980s and 90s. We cannot have that happen again. Again, we won't take people with us, and we won't deserve to take people with us if that's what happens. You call for every fossil fuel industry, every high carbon industry to develop a plan with its workers. It should be done with government. There should be a just transition commission set up by government. You know, you and I were talking just before you came on air about this. It seems absolutely crucial to me. We set up our own in shadow form, the sort of beginnings of a just transition working party, Labour in opposition. But how can we possibly take people with us or make this transition happen in a fair way without that? So that's the third thing. For every high carbon industry, there needs to be a plan. And by the way, the investment. If I take an area like steel, you know, we can have a vibrant, great future for our steel industry, but you've got to invest. You've got to invest to make that transition happen. And 250 million in the Clean Steel Fund in 2023, which is what the government is proposing, is just way short of all the estimates I've seen about what is required. Fourthly, the new jobs that are created. You make this point in your report. It's a point I've been making. Just because we create a job in a low carbon or zero carbon industry doesn't mean it's fair. There is as much of an obligation around jobs in zero carbon industries that they are well paid, that they are unionized, that they are safe, that they involve workers with a voice for workers. All of those things are absolutely essential. And again, I think, and there is good work that's been started on this, I think it's incredibly important that we do this work together. And alongside that, there has got to be the training for workers, both workers who are not involved in high carbon or low carbon industries necessarily, to be able to take up those jobs, and workers in the high carbon industries to transition, if that's what's required, into those jobs. And there's really good union work, I know, going on around the kind of measures we need on skills, and perhaps we can get into that discussion. So fourthly, the new jobs created have got to be well paid, decent jobs that people can be proud to do. And fifth and finally, and in a way this reflects what I've already said, but I think it's worth emphasizing, there's got to be a voice, a proper voice for workers in this transition. This can't be done to workers. It's got to be done with working people. And, you know, I think if you look across the British economy, one of the things that I feel that we massively lack is the proper kind of voice for workers that we see on the continent, in continental Europe, for example. And we need more of that. We need the works councils where workers have a voice. We need strong trade unions with workers having a voice. This is, I think, the Achilles heel of the British economy, not just in terms of fairness, but in terms of economic success. And I want to see that change. And if I was the business secretary, I will be doing everything I could to make it change, because I think the only fair, productive future for our economy is with workers at the center, and not just with lip service, but with a real voice. The last thing I'll say, and then I just want to hear from Sam, is this, which is, we've got to be bold. This, coming back to where I started, when you look at the climate crisis, when you look at all of the issues we face, this is not a time for tinkering around the edges. This is not a time for cautious incrementalism. This is a time to be bold in the investments we need to make. We can't afford not to do this. We've got to make these investments. Joe Biden recognizes this. I'm afraid our government doesn't recognize this properly. We can't be half measures on this. The crisis is too great. The opportunities are there. Workers need to be protected and need to be at the core of this. And that can only be done with a bold vision, a house by house, street by street vision when it comes to transforming homes, a proper plan in relation to transport, not just replacing petrol and diesel cars with electric cars, but the kind of publicly owned, publicly run railway system that we need, the bus services that we need, the production of those green buses, something I've talked about a lot with the trade unions, a plan in relation to industry. Whenever I think about this issue, whenever I talk about climate, I'm reminded both of the scale of the task, but also the urgency. And there's no choice, but to go big in relation to this. I think we've got to work absolutely hand in glove with the trade unions to make this transition fair. I think we can, but now is the time when government has got to step up. And that's what we are going to be pushing them to do over the coming years. And hopefully that will also form the basis of our manifesto at the next general election.
Ed, thank you so much. So much to talk about there, and we'll come back to some of that. Let's hear first of all, before we do that, from Sam, who can give us more of an international perspective. So over to you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sue. And thanks very much for the chance to talk a bit today about just transition, both internationally and in the UK. So it should surprise no one. I agree with everything that Ed just said. I'm going to build on it a little bit. But just to say who I am and what I do, I work for the International Trade Union Confederation. We represent 200 million organized workers in 163 countries. And the Just Transition Center was set up in order to support our affiliates, support unions and our allies in getting good plans for just transition. It was actually a response to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which was negotiated in 2016 or 2015, and also negotiated in the United Nations under the International Labour Organization of Global Rules for Just Transition. So I guess the first message I have is that we have UN architecture and rules for just transition. It's a specific thing. It saves us doing the heavy lifting of figuring out what just transition is and how it takes place, what the goals are. The second thing about just transition is that in 2016, when I started in this work, there were very few examples of just transition. But now we have trade unions, governments, and even employers around the world who are working on getting these plans for just transition, about which you spoke at, and in some cases have succeeded at scale. So the UK is not alone, UK Labour is not alone in pushing for plans for just transition, in pushing for the voice of workers and their unions in social dialogue for just transition, and in calling for these kinds of plans and investments across the economy. just to unpack a little bit what exactly is in a just transition, probably the most important part of just transition is that it is always based on social dialogue. And social dialogue is this very specific thing, which, you know, when you and I were chatting before this event, Sue, you said, yeah, we know what it is, but we're not getting enough of it. And I think that would definitely be the case for unions around the world. But it is this process between workers in our unions, employers, often government, where we sit down and we negotiate usually a binding outcome. And in the case of just transition, what this means is that we workers in our unions, we need to be at the table negotiating the plans for our jobs, our futures, and for sectors. It's not just because it's our right to do so, our right to know as workers, but it's also because we bring knowledge about our sectors and jobs that you can't get anywhere else and that you definitely aren't going to capture in a kind of consultation process where workers are just sort of asked to respond to a hearing document. That's it for us. So one other thing about social dialogue, and something that I personally have seen over and over again with the unions with whom we work, we're working only with unions from high emitting sectors. So that's power and mining, that's oil and gas, steel, cement, auto, other manufacturing, transport, construction, like that. And the start of these processes when unions are trying to get employers to the table, get government to the table, talk to the members, build everybody's confidence. You know, people are really scared and nervous. No person likes to lose her job or to be in fear of losing her job. But what we do see is that this process of just transition, of having workers and unions at the table, really works. It's a way to build this broad support, not only in our movement, in the labor movement, in union households, but also in our networks, which can be extremely broad in communities. And this, once that confidence is there, that there's going to be new jobs for everybody, or that you're going to keep the job you have and be reskilled, get skills in order to do that job with lower emissions, that there will be investments for communities so we don't have stranded and deindustrialized communities, as we know all too well from the UK, but also many other places in the world. And people's attitudes about change and about this sort of massive, very rapid transformation that we're going to go through now, those attitudes change. We have seen that over and over again. It is a huge way to mobilize the power of our movement in support of getting climate action done. Some other things about just transition. You can't have a just transition where you don't have human rights and labor rights, right? Because then if we don't have our rights to freedom of association, to collective bargaining, to freedom of expression, then how are we going to get employers to the table and government too? So it's also about asserting our fundamental human rights as trade unionists in order to get this just transition. And that also includes gender rights and other rights to dignified old age in the form of pension, to healthcare, to fair wages, and so on. I guess, you know, the very best plans for just transition, right now they're focused mostly on the energy sector because that is where most of the emissions come from, but it's also where we're having the biggest and most rapid transformation in terms of the means of producing energy. But just transition, we're going to need just transition for basically every sector, right? If we're going to do something meaningful about climate change, we really mean that we're going to try to get somewhere below 1.5 degrees if we can, avoid even more catastrophic impacts than what we're seeing right now, then we're really talking every job in every sector. And that also means that every job has to be good. So I'll just close. I can go into some specific examples, Sue and Ed, a bit, you know, later in our conversation, but I'll just close by saying that just transition isn't just about all the things that we need to do in order to make sure that, for example, coal miners or people working in coal-fired power will not be left behind. Those things are really important, and they include securing pensions and healthcare, making sure there's a pathway to a new job. Maybe that new job could also be in mining, just not coal, or in mine remediation, or in skilled construction. Ensuring that those new jobs are good jobs. So jobs of equivalent quality, and including wages, security of contract, and so on, to the ones that might be disappearing. Income top-ups where that's not going to be the case. But at least as much as that, we need to look to the future and make sure that there are new jobs, and those new jobs are good jobs. And that includes investing in regions, investing in modern infrastructure, investing in supports that make the sort of soft and hard infrastructure, as President Biden has talked about, all of the good jobs in care and education, research, technology that can lift the floor for everyone, including, but not only, people who today are working in the energy sector. So if you're in a region that's been really dependent on one industry, and it's now going to produce jobs across all sectors, that gives you many more opportunities, both for people to go into new jobs, but also to have decent household incomes, decent incomes for women workers, so that you can lift everybody's boat at once. And that is really what a just transition is about. No one left behind, but also eradicating poverty and rights. So I'm going to stop there, and would be really happy to talk a bit more about some specific examples. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Sam. So I think we've got some big themes to talk about, and there are some questions coming in from our Facebook audience as well. So I think we've all touched on the issues around investment and the inadequacy of government investment currently in the UK, particularly when you compare that with the scale of ambition of Joe Biden when he came into office. But I suppose the issue is, so how do we pitch this? What is the right thing to do? And when we look at it, we're very struck, for example, by the Danish wind industry and the success of that. And I think there are two key factors there. One is, the social partnership and the government support, but also the fact that they've got a long-term strategy, and they've stuck with it and they've kept at it. And that means they've got strong supply chains as well. And it means that their wind industry is 5 times as rich in jobs as the wind industry in the UK. So I suppose the question is, we rightly criticise the government for insufficient investment, but we are talking the need for very large-scale investment. So where is it right for the Labour movement to pitch this? Perhaps come to you first, Ed, on that.
I mean, Sue, look, I think you asked the right question. This has got to be an investment for the future, and this is an investment for the future. We've said, the Labour opposition have said that we should have a 30 billion green stimulus over 18 months. We said that last autumn. That continues to be our position. And in a sense, and that's the sort of down payment, I think, for what we need to do at the next election. And actually, if you look at the IPPR report you referred to, they say there needs to be 30 billion a year of investment. Somebody asked in the chat, can we afford to do it? My answer is unequivocally yes. Interest rates are low, and I think we've got to not see this as if you like, a consumption by government. This is an investment. And I say that not just as a sort of rhetorical point, but also that we need to think about the paybacks we get and how we invest our resources. Let me give you a very concrete example. We've said in relation to the gigafactories that we need, these are the battery factories that we need in order to ensure we protect and indeed enhance our automotive sector. We've said government should be willing to take equity stakes in these gigafactories so they get the upside, so it's not just a subsidy. And actually, I've talked to people in the private sector and they say, look, that's perfectly reasonable. And that sort of principle, that idea goes beyond this. If you think it goes beyond the automotive sector, if you think about investing in the kind of retrofit program that we need, that will be job creating. This is the Stern report of 2007 was so clear about this. It was a seminal moment because Stern said the costs of not acting on climate are greater than the costs of acting. And the argument often made about borrowing is we shouldn't put our kids and grandkids in the problem of having to deal with the debts. Let me just say very clearly, putting our kids and grandkids into the position of having to is a far, far bigger burden than borrowing to invest in tackling that problem. And I'm absolutely convinced about that. So I think we absolutely can afford to do it, and we've got to be bold and we've got to be clear about it.
Thanks, Seth. Sam, is there anything we should learn from other countries who've done this better?
Yes. So I'm speaking to you from the U.S., where right outside the nation's capital, where we're 4 days into yet another record heat wave. But at the same time, the government is using money, taking advantage of this moment, this terrible moment, because we're still in a pandemic. We're still in a kind of jobs apocalypse where so many jobs have been lost over the last half, taking advantage of this moment to put money, invest in the economy and invest in jobs. And, the plan that President Biden has put forward, the American Jobs Act, the American Families Act, which would invest especially in care jobs, make it possible for women to come back to the workforce, because so many of us have had to drop out over the last year and a half without access to good childcare, all of the safety issues around the pandemic. That kind of thinking, that kind of bold vision for the country will create literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of good family sustaining jobs. And those jobs in turn, along with things like the American Manufacturing Executive Order, those things will make sure that a lot of those jobs stay in the US and don't get offshored. This is happening now in the UK. So that's one very good example. The jobs that are embodied in these actions from the federal government, they're not going to do everything that one needs to do in the US on climate change, but it would be a huge start in some key sectors, such as clean energy, such as public transport, such as electrification of the auto sector, and getting started on that in some of the world's biggest auto markets. A lot of the different pieces of legislation that are moving through the US Congress right now also have job standards attached to them. And I just want to highlight that as something that governments can do to make sure that the new jobs that get created by investment are good jobs. You can attach labor standards to investment. You'll get plenty of pushback from some of the employers who wanted to do it the bad old way or offshore, but you can require employers to, who are getting any kind of public investment, to make sure that there's local economic development and to set even minimum standards for the jobs that get created. And those standards can also apply in the supply chain. And we have seen actually that thinking at work in the US. We played a small role in getting the Danish offshore wind company Ørsted to the table with US labor to negotiate a broad framework agreement for good jobs in the construction of all of Ørsted's wind farms in the US. And that has since snowballed to discussions with other big offshore wind developers and to a draft rule from the federal government, which will require good jobs agreements at least for the construction phase of every single offshore wind farm that is built in the United States. So a lot of stuff is possible when you have the right government, and also when you have employers like Ørsted that, at least with some pressure from their Danish unions at home, are willing to play ball. I'll just note that in Denmark, indeed, as you said, Sue, Denmark produced world-leading wind sector industries. That was part of a 30-year strategy, but it was also part of social dialogue between the trade unions, the government, and the employers, and that Ørsted itself is actually still majority state-owned, as are many of the biggest players now in renewable energy and in offshore wind. They started their lives as national utilities, and many of them, like EDF, but also NL, also Engie, still have either majority state ownership or part state ownership. So that is definitely a way to not only for governments to invest, but also to get returns. It's something in Norway, where I'm actually based full time, that we did very successfully in building our oil industry, but also our renewable energy company, Statkraft, is the biggest provider of renewable energy in Europe, I believe, and it is 100% state-owned. This is a model that works. It's not some relic from the past. It's actually enabled many of these renewable energy companies that are out competing in international markets to do what they do. And it's a way for us to get returns on these big investments that governments are making. I think the last thing to say is that in Germany, a big part of the agreement that is going to phase out coal-fired power in Germany no later than 2038, and that has been embraced, I'm going to say it, embraced by the mining and energy unions. They were a key part of negotiating that agreement. It is a good deal for their members. Is 40 billion euro that will go to the coal regions in Germany over a period of, I think, 10 years. And that 40 billion is not the number for workers. That's a much smaller number. This is the number that is going to bring modern infrastructure, in particular to a couple of regions in the former East Germany, and drive economic development, drive diversification of the economy. And it will not only create jobs, but it will put money in the pockets of people who are getting the new jobs, which they will be using in the economy. It's going to increase tax payments. It's going to increase economic activity. So investment by governments now, while interest rates are low, is a big thing that can also help us drive this recovery we really need from COVID-19.
Thanks, Sam. I think we're all tremendously excited by the work that you've been doing in the US with Ørsted, and hoping that we're going to be able to spread those kinds of benefits in the UK as well. But what you said takes me, I think, really nicely into something else I wanted to ask Ed. And you've talked about the benefits of direct government intervention. So in the UK, we've still got a long way to go on energy, but I think, energy has done more to decarbonise than some other key sectors of the economy. So if we look at transport, for example, what we've seen as people have returned to workplaces after the pandemic is a shift from public transport systems into increased use of private vehicles. And of course, we haven't yet got any government thinking on heat and buildings, which are two of the more challenging areas, I think, certainly in terms of who's going to pay for the changes we need to make. And I don't think the government has agreement on that, but it does seem to me this is a key illustration of the limits of market-based solutions. So I wondered, Ed, if you've got some comments on that, because for all of us, I think, this issue about who pays and social equity and social justice has to be really important. We can't just load all of these costs onto individuals' bills.
I do agree with you, Sue. And for those of us in the sort of, train spotting business is not quite the right way of putting it, but those of us who are sort of watching and waiting for the government's heat and building strategy, it's been a long wait. And I think it was due last spring, 2020. And obviously, understandably, the pandemic knocked them somewhat, of course, but it was then due this spring. Spring has become summer. We're now told it's not going to be until the autumn. And you sort of think, well, why have they got this problem? And I think you, characteristically, if I may say so, Sue, have put your finger on it, which is they are caught between their core beliefs, which are around markets, and the core reality, which is we're never going to make this work unless we have a government-led plan and a government-led approach. Now, what does that involve, in my view? First of all, it needs a proper plan for retrofit, house by house, street by street retrofit plan. I think it could easily be led by local authorities. In fact, the local authority investment that the government provided sort of a year or so ago has been pretty successful, even by their own account. Whereas the privatized outsourced Green Homes grant was a complete fiasco, which then got cancelled, and the money, I think, snaffled back by the Treasury, as far as I can tell. So, first of all, you need a proper retrofit plan. Secondly, you need a proper plan to make alternatives, whether that's heat pumps or hydrogen, affordable for people and possible for people. Thirdly, you need a plan for new buildings to be zero carbon. Now, this is where the government, I'm afraid, is more culpable almost than any other area, because in 2016, the Labour government had legislated, the previous Labour government legislated for homes to be zero carbon by 2016. The government got rid of that plan. 800,000 homes have already been built not to a zero carbon standard, which will now have to be retrofitted. It's going to be hundreds of thousands of more before we get to a proper zero carbon home standard. I can't tell you how many, because we don't know exactly when this new plan is coming into place. So that's the sort of contours, in my view, of the kind of plan that we need. It's got to be fair. It goes back to my point about finance. Indeed, this is the area where I think there is the most need, actually, for government finance to make this possible. I think it is doable, this. I was talking to some people from the energy sector the other day, and there are different views, as you all know very well, Sue, on heat pumps versus hydrogen. But some people are more optimistic about what heat pumps can do in terms of the costs. They cite the examples of the renewable sector. Some people are less optimistic. But I think this is doable. But this has got to be collectively managed, and the costs have got to be collectively borne. And I think unless we do that, we're going to be in quite a lot of trouble in terms of making this transition happen. So that's just some thoughts. I'm not going to pretend this is easy, but that's some thoughts. And I think it is worth saying just finally, of all the areas, this and transport are the areas where there's been least progress. I think I'm right in saying that emissions from the household sector are more or less the same level they were a decade ago. Now, by anyone's standards, that is not progress. And it's certainly not the path to net zero. So the government has really got to up its game, and it's got to accept that you can't do this on the cheap, and you can't do this by relying on the market.
Absolutely. And you are right about that. Household sector, transport, really not shifted at all. It's energy and actually waste that has made some progress. Just in terms of switching tack slightly, in terms of opportunities, I think it would be remiss to have this discussion without talking a bit about skills and access to jobs for people. Now, certainly in the UK, we look at some of these high carbon sectors, we see sectors which are quite undiverse in terms of their current workforces, some of them actually with aging workforces. And we know that we need to expand and diversify those workforces actually to meet the transformation, to be able to meet the transformation we need to make. But also, of course, this is an area where the skills that are needed are going to be changing over time as new technologies come on board. But also we know there's increased importance of digital and data skills already in these areas. So Sam, if I could start with you, could you share with us any experience from elsewhere where there's been not just good industrial strategies, but good skills strategies to aid these transformations?
Yeah, that would be hard. because I would definitely say that in a lot of sectors, we are not yet seeing the kind of lifelong rights to lifelong learning, education, and reskilling that we're going to need for this transition. But the other thing I would say is that in a lot of places, it's not really a skills gap, it's actually a wages gap. So when employers are saying, oh, we can't get people, they don't have the right skills, often the right question is, well, what are you paying people and what are you doing to offer them secure employment? And how are you, for example, investing in the people that you already have and making sure that they have the skills they need to be redeployed into new sectors of your company? So maybe I could just start there and say that we do have a few major energy companies in different countries that actually have taken on board this principle of retain, retrain, and redeploy with the people that they have, so that people get the chance to move into, for example, to move from a coal-fired power station to renewable energy or even to natural gas distribution. And we think that's a good starting point for the skills discussion. But the bigger question is indeed about this combination of different forces of transformation. So one is what we need to do in order to have a meaningful response to climate change, what that means for skills and jobs in a lot of different sectors. But the other is also digitalization. And just to say that with Industrial Europe, which is the federation for all of the industrial unions in Europe and the UK, and with the European Trade Union Confederation, we're actually embarking on a campaign for just transition in the auto sector. And a big part of that campaign is actually focused on skills, because what's happening in the auto sector, also in the UK, is that cars are becoming more and more digitalized. So we have that happening. We have tons of software that's being added to vehicles, less traditional manufacturing, at the same time that battery production is speeding up. And often both the software and battery parts of manufacturing a car, companies are just saying, okay, we're creating these new companies or we're outsourcing these jobs, and collective bargaining agreements that we have with you all, people working in car manufacturing, they're not going to apply, and we're not really very keen on having unions at these new jobs. So what we, if we want an example of good practice, what we see, for example, in Sweden is that Volvo has decided to bring its battery production back in-house. They've established a massive battery production facility, and all of those jobs are going to be good union jobs. So I think the question about skills is also related to questions about our rights to organize, our ability to get comprehensive lifelong rights to reskilling and retraining from governments. And finally, for employers to do their part to provide good portable skills and retraining to people they have employed today.
Thanks, Sam. That's very interesting. Ed, on this issue of skills, do you think what we need in the UK is a better joining up across government departments and functions? Because it seems to me you can't think about the skills we're going to need to decarbonise the economy and the industrial strategy as two separate things. We need a more of a joined up approach to that. And actually, we hear a lot of employers talking about this, and the current mantra, as you know, is employer-led skills programs. But some of these are so long-term that you can't rely on employers to do it. And lots of statements about diversifying the workforce, but we haven't really seen that accelerating to the extent that we need it. So I suppose two questions for you, Ed. Would Labour organise itself to get a more joined up approach? And do you think there are more levers that government can use to accelerate progress towards the skills we need for net zero?
I'll answer that in a sec, Sue. Just tell me this, because I've read your Green Jobs Task Force. I just wonder, as you think about that Green Jobs Task Force, what do you think is the single biggest thing that could make a difference on the skills side?
I think thinking about it from the worker perspective and gearing up from the worker perspective, so that whether you're just starting your career or you're in your mid-50s and you haven't had any formal skills training for a long time, you can have access in the way that you need it to upskill or reskill. So I think that means being agile, innovative, thinking beyond traditional forms of skills training. So I think it's about access, but I also think it's about accreditation. I think skills provided by an employer for an employer meet a need, but if we're expecting people to be mobile and move through their careers, they need to have their skills accredited to help them, to support them to be able to do that. So I think it's access and accreditation, I think.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, let's be honest about this. The skills sort of landscape in Britain is a head-scratching, confusing, contradictory, overlapping sort of situation, and very, very messy, both for employers and for workers. I don't think that's just started under this government, but it maybe has got a bit worse. I mean, I think that the principles here are surely that it's got to be as easy as possible for workers and indeed employers, and it's got to be as close to free as possible. I was quite struck talking to workers in the automotive sector a month or two back, that they were saying, look, and this is when you look at the statistics on the auto sector, 80% of powertrain workers are going to see their jobs change, and they're going to see their skills required change. And they were saying to me, well, how are we going to fund that? How are we going to make that happen? How are we going to make sure that our workers have the skills? And, I'm quite struck by that. And also the accounts I've heard about the apprenticeship levy, that it's just not fit for purpose when it comes to these issues. I know there is also good work going on around how, I think among green campaigners and others, working with the trade unions, about this idea of a sort of an offshore passport, I think it's been called, that would enable workers to transfer from one sector, from the fossil fuel sector to the renewable sector. For example, I think it was a Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth and others, and Unite and so on, have been working together on this. I don't know whether you've got a view on whether that offers a way forward. Somebody in the chat has made the point about Union Learn, and that seems to me to be a really good point, because Gavin Williamson put an end to it for terrible reasons, as the person says in the chat. So I think I'd sort of say, this is why I was asking whether there was a particular thing that you think could make a difference. I'd say it's sort of action on all fronts, really.
Yeah.
It's like, if I'm frank with you, I think if you're a worker at the moment thinking, well, how do you transition? And I had this, by the way, with the aerospace sector when I was just right in the middle of the crisis. Lots of the people the employers in the sector were saying, look, if some of our workers who are not going to be able to carry on in the sector, why is there not the opportunity for them to transition? So I think ease, the sort of cost, all of those things have just got to be made much, much more seamless and much, much easier for workers. And this is why I liked your idea in the Green Jobs Task Force of every high carbon industry having a sense of a plan, and indeed government having a sense of a plan. Because the minute you have a sense of a plan, you've got to say, okay, so how many workers are we going to need in this sector? What are the skills they're going to need? Where can they come from? How do we provide it to them? And my sense is there's no guiding mind. And without a guiding mind, it's just a mess.
Absolutely agree with that. And of course, it's perfectly possible to have a plan because we know the changes that we need to make. Conscious of time, we've got a few minutes left. I think it would be very strange if we had this conversation today without touching on the COP26 conference towards the end of the year. And somebody in the chat has asked about government pressure on big emitters like India and China, and what can government do to put pressure on those. So I think that's one part of the question. But I think I'd also like to ask you, perhaps not what your expectations of COP are, but what do you think is the key thing that could be achieved at COP26 this year? Let's start with you, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And just to add a couple of points on the last discussion, apprenticeships are absolutely key. Also to diversifying the workforce. We have good examples of that, especially from Canadian trade unions through something called community benefits. So that would be something to check out. But apprenticeships and labor management cooperation on developing skills programs is a way to make sure that workers get those good portable skills they need. On to the COP. So your government is doing a couple of things. There's this energy transition declaration, which is making its way through different political capitals where Western or wealthy governments are committing to fund just transition along with climate action in different countries. That's a positive step. But the things that we think that your government could do, for example, in India, are to put its, not inconsiderable weight and investment and finance and political convening behind getting a just transition and not just focusing on privatizing state-owned enterprises, but rather providing supports to workers and to regions and providing technology and know-how to these companies so that they can bring down their emissions and shift their asset bases. Because what we're seeing internationally, we work with unions all over the world, right? So we're working with coal mining and energy unions in India right now on a project on an initiative on just transition in the coal sector in India. Same thing, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and so on. And what we see is that often interventions from government and also your government right now are really focused on splitting up and privatizing the power sector and the mining sector and creating opportunities for your businesses. And I got to say that when workers encounter that, they just hear job losses. So if you really want worker support for this transition, because all of our unions understand the change is coming, then it would be good to support actual shifts in asset bases, supports for workers, things that will create good new low emissions jobs on a regional level. Beyond that, China, this is really hard, right? Because the main way of engaging China that Western governments have had on climate change is through multilateralism. But because of a range of reasons, including human rights issues, but also big trade issues, multilateralism isn't functioning so well right now. So we're going to have to find ways also through COP26 to engage China again on climate change. We have to see what that's going to look like.
Thanks, Sam. And over to you, Ed.
Well, look, I think I agree with lots of what Sam said. One way to think about this is that is in the context of, dare I mention, the place, Copenhagen, which I was at in 2009. Why did Copenhagen fail? I mean, there's lots of reasons, but it was partly mistrust between developing and developed countries, or mistrust of developed countries by developing countries, a lot of it for good reason. Now, what then, and I don't think we're going to have another Copenhagen, because I think there's much more political will, not least on the part of China, to move on this. But we could either have a successful COP or basically an unsuccessful COP, which won't collapse, but is just sort of unsuccessful. Why are these COPs important? Because they put world leaders on the spot, and they're a forcing mechanism to put climate at the top of the political agenda. And just to be clear about the purpose of this COP, it's to close the gap between the high-level ambitions of Paris, to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, and the bottom-up pledges, which added up to something approaching 3 degrees of warming. Now, we've probably got that down to 2.5 degrees, which is still terrible. But, there's been some progress. What else needs doing? Urgently, if I was in Alok Sharma's shoes, the president of the COP, I would say that the developed countries have got to deliver to developing countries on the $100 billion of finance promised to Copenhagen, still not delivered, on vaccines. We've undermined our own moral authority by cutting overseas aid, the only G7 country to do it in the year of the COP, even though our overseas spending, comparatively speaking, is not the lowest. It's a terrible thing to have done, appalling thing to have done, morally and strategically. So the developed world have got to deliver on the promises made to developing countries well before the COP. And then we've got to put pressure on all the large emitting countries to really step up. And that does include China. China is 28%, I think, of global emissions. They've set a very laudable target of net zero by 2060, which I think is a major step forward. But long-term targets, and this doesn't just apply to China, it applies to Australia and other countries, long-term targets are just no good if they're not accompanied by short-term action, because what happens in this decade is so absolutely decisive. So we need to reassemble the high ambition coalition that existed in Paris, which was vulnerable countries, forward-thinking developed countries acting together to really, really push as hard as we can. And the aim of COP26 is to keep 1.5 degrees alive. We probably won't get to the kind of emissions reductions we need to say we are going now to achieve 1.5 degrees, but we've got to make a lot more progress than we're set to make at the moment. So I actually think this is a really important 3 or 4 months to really put pressure on our government as the hosts, on all governments around the world, to step up and to embarrass world leaders, frankly. If you're Australia and you're not making any progress on this, as they're not, in terms of where they were in Paris, they've got to be really have the sort of the spotlight shone on them to say, what are you going to do? And by the way, it also includes China. As I say, China has made progress since Copenhagen, but there's a lot more that China needs to be doing, and there's no solution to this challenge without China stepping up more than it has.
Thank you. I agree with all of that, and actually felt ashamed of the way the vote in Parliament went this week on overseas aid. I think it shames us all. Thank you both. We are running out of time. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. There will be lots more, including around COP, where I know the TUC is working very closely with the ITUC to ensure there's an effective trade union voice there. Just to bring us back to where we started, which is about trade union priorities for the climate. I think Ed's absolutely right. This is a crucial decade. We do need to make real progress this decade. And as you both said, it is about good quality employment for everyone and no worker left behind. And I think that is our guiding principle as a trade union and labour movement. Thank you both ever so much for your contributions. Thanks to everybody who's been listening through Facebook and other channels. Hope you enjoy the rest of the Toll Puzzle Festival, and hopefully you get out now and have some fresh air and enjoy the lovely sunshine. So thank you all.